Hello and welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Leah Stokes, our Jeffrey S. and Margaret Mais Padnos Fellow. In 2019, with an unprecedented number of Democratic hopefuls in the presidential primary race, Leah Stokes took to social media to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate's proposed climate policies. Within months, campaigns were calling her directly to ask for advice. In the years that followed, Leah has become one of the most prolific defining voices for clean energy policy in the United States. She believes that while individual efforts to curb climate change are important, collective action and federal and international level are necessary to wean society off fossil fuel. In 2021, she co-authored roadmaps which became the backbone of some of the climate policies at the heart of the Inflation Reduction Act. She fought endlessly for the bill's passage despite resistance from Congress. In addition to her advocacy and policy work, Leah is a professor of environmental policy at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and co-hosts the popular climate podcast, A Matter of Degrees. While at Radcliffe, she is working on her next book, The Campaign for the Future. The book traces the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act while also telling the stories of several new parents, including herself, working tirelessly to make the legislation reality. She hopes that it will illustrate what a small group of people can do to stop the climate crisis and to change the world in which the next generation of children will grow up. Today, the Q&A session of the program will be hosted by this year's Schutzer Fellow, Oscar Lopez. And now, please join me in welcoming Leah Stokes.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's wonderful to be here today. First, I want to thank my fellow fellows who have been such an inspiration. The artists in particular have inspired me to take up crochet and wear a ridiculous sweater today, so they get the praise or blame for that. I also want to thank the Radcliffe staff who have been so supportive, particularly with childcare support through this program, which I think is super important. I want to thank my research partner, Maddie Rinaldi, who's helped with this book project, my assistant, Jess Lata, my husband, who's here today. I also want to thank, it's a little emotional, I don't know why, Shanti Kleinman, who's been such an amazing support for me. I want to thank two people from the hospital who helped with my children when they were born, Dr. Catherine Ekwa Ikoko and Gail Moran. And I want to thank the people who've talked to me for this book project. So last year, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. It was the largest investment in climate action in American history. And it was something that I worked on alongside thousands of other activists across the United States. And so this book project that I'm working on tells the story of a bunch of these activists working to try to pass this law. And as was mentioned by Claudia, it also tells the story of a bunch of new parents who were going through big life changes whilst trying to protect the future for their own children. So I'm a political scientist, and you may know this particular image, right? This is Schoolhouse Rock. It's how a bill becomes a law. And he sings, he says, "I'm just a bill, oh, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill." And he tells the story about how he goes to the House of Representatives, and he goes to the Senate, and then he makes it to the president's desk. And in many ways, that's the story I'm telling in the book, but it is slightly more complicated than that, you'll be shocked to hear. One of the things in this video, if you go back to it, is that he says that bills start with an idea. And this is the image that they show. It's a bunch of people coming up with an idea about how there ought to be a law for that. And so this is where I think laws really start. They start with ideas. And I'm going to go back to a perhaps surprising starting point. I just rewatched this documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. How many people have seen this film? Right? It was a real watershed film. It came out in 2006. It won the best documentary that year, and it really changed the conversation about climate. And as I was thinking about my own journey in climate action, which began just before this film came out, I decided I had to rewatch this movie. I needed to understand what we were talking about in this sort of first wave of really big public consciousness around climate change. And I remember distinctly when this film came out, Al Gore actually came to Toronto, where I was living I was an undergrad at the time, and he gave a talk, and I got to sit in the front row, even got to shake his hand, which was super exciting for me as a, I suppose, budding nerd, political scientist to be. And I remember vividly that at the end of the film, there was a black screen where words came up, and it told us what we could do about climate change. So I thought, I gotta go back to that. I need to say, some of you maybe remember the black screen. Yes, nice. So I went back, I was like, okay, I gotta do it. So here it is. My memory did not fail me in this particular instance. It says, the climate crisis can be solved. Here's how to start. You can reduce your carbon emissions. In fact, you can even reduce your carbon emissions to 0. You ready for it? Buy efficient appliances and light bulbs. Recycle. And that was very much the zeitgeist at the time. I was running my first climate campaign. It's called Rewire, and I ran it with my husband. And as you can see, he wasn't my husband at the time. That took a couple decades. But as you can see here, what is this symbol? It's an iconic, outdated, compact fluorescent light bulb, right? This is pre-LEDs, let's be real. But we thought we were gonna change the world by installing efficient lights. That was gonna do it, right? We were gonna take on the climate crisis that way. And so in this particular instance, we got people to turn off the lights. We got them to save energy. And you know what? They saved about 12% of the energy. Not so bad. That's actually pretty good for a behavior change campaign, I just wanna say. And this is another image. This is the city of Toronto where I was living at the time in 2008. I'm actually in this photo. You can't quite see me. You have to like blow it up really, like I'm super tiny. But I'm there in this photo. And this was a campaign in 2008 called Earth Hour. Did anybody participate in this? 50 million people around the world participated in this campaign. We all sat in the dark for an hour. I did it, 2008. This was going to change the world, right? If we just turned off the lights, we could solve the climate crisis. And these ideas, this kind of paradigm that comes out of this moment persists today. We asked, with Rewiring America, a bunch of Americans, what is the #1 thing they think that individuals can do to fight the climate crisis? We asked this in 2022, and this is the audience participation part. Somebody shout out what you think the answer was. Recycling. Wow, Oscar for the win. Indeed. Recycling. #1 answer. So, and this is, but just to be clear, I'm not criticizing Al Gore, who won the Nobel Prize for a reason and has done far more than most human beings on the climate crisis, and he deserves that award. But the way we as a movement, the way we as a society thought about this problem was fundamentally limited. I love this comic by Tommy Siegel. I talk about this comic all the time. It says, it's that easy. In the 80s, pick up your litter and you can save the earth. In the 90s, recycle and you can save the earth. In the 2000s, reduce your carbon footprint and you can save the earth. Finally, in the 2010s, we took a slight detour, completely restructure global economic systems, and you may be able to save a remnant of humanity. It's a bit of a paradigm shift there, right? So that's the first paradigm that I really saw when I went back to An Inconvenient Truth. Now, the film, it has actually aged quite well. The science is very accurate, really interesting to rewatch, and it takes up about 3/4 of the movie. But you get to the end, that's the solutions part, right? So here is Al Gore standing in front of a diagram, the wedges diagram, pretty popular thing at the time. Sokolow and Pakula helped come up with this idea, and it was like, okay, we can just think about all these ways that we're going to reduce pollution and add them up, and bada boom, bada bing, we're there. And what I noticed when I went back to this image, we've got 6 things lined up, right? What is the commonality in 5 of them? Efficiency. The word efficiency. It comes up again and again and again. And to be clear, I was falling asleep last night and thinking about this. You know in Microsoft Word you can create hotkeys, like shortcuts, like if there's a word you type too often, and you're like, this is before autocomplete and things like that. I programmed EE to spell energy efficiency because I was typing energy efficiency so frequently. So I was part of the problem, is what I'm trying to say. So this was really the paradigm that we were in for a long time, and in some ways we still are in, that we could use individual action and energy efficiency to solve this problem. And I'm not going to get into this today, but there's another strand there too, another meaning of the word efficiency, which is economic efficiency, right? That we could make marginal improvements to the system. We could send signals that would just tweak things in a certain way, like, I don't know, a carbon price, right? A tax on carbon, an emissions trading system, and that would just tweak behaviors, change things at the margin, and we would solve this problem. And if you're interested in a critique of that, I wrote a piece with Matto Mildenberger in the Boston Review called The Trouble with Carbon Pricing, where we get into that. But I don't have enough time to quite debunk economics today on top of everything else. So where did we go? We started to change the paradigm, right? That's what the Tommy Siegel cartoon is pointing us to. And in 2018, when newly elected Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in fact, she was representative-elect at the time, she spent one of her first days on the Hill in Nancy Pelosi's office staging a protest alongside the Sunrise Movement, alongside people like then Executive Director Varshini Prakash, an amazing climate activist from the Boston area. And, you know, they said, hey, I think instead of getting people to recycle, maybe we should pass a Green New Deal. We should restructure our society. This idea caught fire, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many people sent me this idea. And of course, I was drawn into its orbit and inspired by this activism that these people took. And I want to say that this activism, of course, goes farther back in time. We could really trace it back decades, but I want to trace it back just 2 years. This is the protest at Standing Rock Reservation against the Dakota Access Pipeline. You may remember that there is still a pipeline that is being built, trying to be built through Standing Rock, and the community stood up and said no. Keep in mind there was an alternative route for that pipeline that could have gone through a white community, but they decided to put it through this indigenous community, and there was a protest. And then Donald Trump, you may remember, he got elected in 2016. I don't know, that's hard to remember that one. And people showed up in droves to support this community that was resisting fossil fuel infrastructure in a collective way. One of the people who went to that protest was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was not a representative at the time, she was a bartender, and she decided to drive across the country to go to this protest. And she says that she decided to run for office because of this experience, of being part of collective action, because of her experience at Standing Rock. And it was actually the day after she left that she got a phone call from these activists who were running progressive people for Congress. So the Green New Deal, as the indigenous scholar Nick Estes has pointed out, can really be traced back as well to this resistance. So let's talk about that first paradigm shift. We are not trying to get people to recycle. We are not trying to make this about individual action. In fact, it is the fossil fuel company BP that really popularized the idea of a carbon footprint, because it took away the focus off of big polluters and put it onto everyday people, as if we were all to blame for the energy system around us. And so the paradigm shift is towards organizing. And I like to use the image of an Excel spreadsheet to show that, because as I like to say, the spreadsheet is mightier than the sword. And that is not just a cheesy statement, it's also true. If you've ever organized, you know you need a spreadsheet to do it, because you need to know who's going to do what, where, when, and you need to come back and make sure they did it, right? So we need to actually organize if we want to change the system. Let's talk about that second paradigm that I mentioned, energy efficiency, and the shift that happens in this period. So this is from the Alliance to Save Energy. It's an organization that started just after An Inconvenient Truth came out, right? And they were running campaigns just like I was running as an undergraduate. They were going into, for example, shopping markets and having eureka moments with everyday people. Like, did you know compact fluorescent light bulbs exist and you could use them and your bills could go down? Wow, so exciting. These are the campaigns that they were running. And I just want to point out who was funding this work. It's a little bit tiny. You might not be able to see, so I'm just going to blow that up for you. Oh, the American Gas Association. Interesting. Huh. The lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry started to fund energy efficiency in the wake of popular collective consciousness about the climate crisis. And it's not just the American Gas Association. I decided to look in that 2007 annual report that they put out, still on the internet. You know, it looks pretty 2007 to me. And this is really the who's who of climate denial. These are organizations who funded denial throughout the 1990s, as Naomi Oreskes, a Harvard professor, has shown in detail. That's things like the American Petroleum Institute and, of course, ExxonMobil, but it's also the who's who of climate denial from the electric utility industry. I recently wrote a paper where we looked at which electric utilities were funding climate denial during this period when fossil fuel companies were funding climate denial. And these are them, my friends. We found the same people, the same organizations who were funding climate denial from the utility industry were also funding energy efficiency campaigns. They were saying, yeah, we can solve this climate thing. It's just going to be marginal improvements on a fossil fuel-based energy system. Like, that'll work, right? It's not going to threaten us. And so we have Southern Company, we have Duke Energy, American Electric Power, et cetera. And Sempra, in case you're wondering, is the parent company for SoCalGas. I think one of the ways we can most iconically see this period and the way we thought about the world is this. Anybody know what this is? What is this? It's a Prius, indeed. I drove a Prius. Anybody else drove a Prius back then? Nice, popular, right? And we really saw that this was our way of doing the right thing. And I want to be clear, it was a good thing to do at the time. But you know what the thing about a Prius is? From the first day you buy it, you know it had that also like video game style thing where you were supposed to, brake only so much so that you could just use as little oil as possible. But you know what the problem is? The day you drove it off the lot, it ran on oil. And the last day you ran it, it ran on oil. This is a fossil fuel machine. No shade against the Prius owners. I was one of them. But it is fundamentally a fossil fuel machine. Guess what this is? Anybody recognize this? The Chevy Bolt. Wow, we got some real car people or, I don't know what, climate people in the front. Right, this is a Chevy Bolt. This is a really interesting paradigm shift, right? Because suddenly, you know what this can run on? Electricity. And that electricity will be as dirty as it is on day one that you buy that car. Maybe it'll be a mix of gas and coal, maybe some wind and some solar. But guess what? You stick solar on your roof, your car can be 100% running on solar. And as the grid around you gets cleaner and cleaner with every year, not just by chance, but through activism, collective action, your car gets cleaner too. So this is the machine that does not run on oil on day one, and does not run on oil on the last day. In fact, it gets, in a certain sense, cleaner over time as the electricity system gets cleaner. That is a paradigm shift. My particular passion is this one. This is a furnace. In Massachusetts, actually, a lot of them run on oil and propane, very expensive and very dirty. Some of them, of course, run on gas, too. These are delivered fuels. And that machine, even if you buy an Energy Star, super efficient gas furnace, it runs on fossil fuels. This is a heat pump, or at least it's a schematic of a heat pump. It runs on electricity. And so, whatever the grid mix is on day one, that's as clean as it is, and then the last day, it gets cleaner. I started to see the world differently. I was at this point, 12, 15 years into working on climate change. This is how long it took me. Paradigm shifts kind of mess with you, they take a while. And I started to think about, okay, here is all the pollution in the United States. It comes from these sectors. We've got the electric power sector, it's about a quarter, the transportation sector, another quarter, we got buildings, it's about an eighth, industry is about another quarter, and then we got agriculture. And I started to think, well, how can we remove pollution from these parts of our economy. The first thing we need to do is clean up our electricity system. This is what I spent a lot of time, my first book, thinking about how to do that. Once we have 100% clean electricity, and even on the current grid mix, we can use that electricity to power, of course, our cars, but not just our cars. We can power mopeds, we can power bicycles, we can power trains. You may not know this, but in the South, for example, in the United States, a lot of our trains run on diesel. They're very dirty. We could electrify those trains. We could electrify trucks that largely go through low-income communities and communities of color. So it's not just cars. And of course, airplanes will be a little hard to electrify, so that one we won't do. But the lion's share of the transportation sector, we can electrify. We can also electrify buildings through those heat pump water heaters, induction stoves. And this chunk here, heavy industry, we often say is the hard to decarbonize sector, right? This is difficult to do. But what people don't realize is that about half of it can be electrified. Not everything is a steel plant or a cement plant. Some things are beverage manufacturing, food manufacturing, pulp and paper, and they can run on the same electric machines as all the other parts of our society. And so what I started to realize is that just two things, clean electricity combined with electrification, could actually solve 3/4 of the climate problem in the United States. So the next paradigm shift that I think we've really gone through in this intervening period is away from efficiency as an end goal, this marginal incremental improvements on a fundamentally fossil fuel-based system, towards clean electricity and electrification, which is a transformational change. So if I were to go back to this film, to this ending, when I rewatched this a couple of weeks ago, I thought, this is just a factually inaccurate statement. So if I was going to edit it, I might say, in fact, you cannot reduce your carbon emissions to zero unless you organize with others to restructure our energy system through clean energy and electrification. So just a couple addendums there. But, like I said, Al Gore, nothing but love. 14 years later, you know what the problem with paradigm shifts are? They take time. And in the intervening period, the youth of yesterday, like me, they grow gray hairs. They start to get older. Maybe they have families, get married. Maybe they gain a little bit of power along the way, so that's an upside. But the gray hairs, you got to pay for that somehow. And in that time period, you know what else happened? The climate crisis got worse because we largely did not change our energy system. And so I'm going to take you now to the year 2020, which was the second hottest year on record, just behind 2016. This was when we had a massive Democratic primary. There were more than 24 people running for the presidential nomination in the Democratic Party. I don't know if people watch these debates. They came on night after night. There were so many people. I mean, I'm a political scientist, so I could name them all. But we know that the average American person would maybe name one of them. And that's the guy who won. His name is Joe Biden. But the other people, right, maybe they didn't know them. Some people loved, of course, Sanders. Some people were into Warren. I don't know what Tulsi Gabbard was doing there. And then there was this guy. Anybody know who he is? Who's this? Any guesses from the audience? I know there's a lot of them. Like I said, we're not all political scientists memorizing all the people. Anybody know? Jay Inslee. Wow, Dina for the win. All right, Jay Inslee, Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State. This person decided to run for president. Why? Because he wanted to lift up climate change as an issue. And it was pretty exciting for us super nerds out there who knew who the heck he was and were paying attention. And he had staff who decided to write 200 pages of plans as part of the campaign for what we could do on climate change if we took it seriously as a national mobilization, what we could do to flesh out that vision of a Green New Deal that Representative AOC and, of course, Senator Markey had really launched 2 years prior. Two of those people who wrote those very long documents were Sam Ricketts and Bracken Hendricks, who would become some of my closest friends and allies for the work ahead. Because when I read those documents, I felt really excited. They included ideas like, hey, could we get to 100% clean electricity by 2035? This was a really bold vision. 2035, we're going to have an entirely clean grid. And these activists managed to slowly, well, really campaign staffers turned activists because, I don't know, spoiler alert, this guy didn't become president. They managed to get other candidates to adopt these ideas, including eventually then Vice President Joe Biden. He ended up running on the same ideas that Governor Inslee was running on, including 100% clean electricity by 2035. And of course, part of the reason why then Vice President Joe Biden took up these ideas was because the youth movement of today was so much more effective than the youth movement of my era. They were focused on collective action. They were focused on transformational change. They were not interested in efficiency. They were not interested in individual action. And they really changed the way we talked about this. They said, we've got 11 years. There's a deadline here, people. This is coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that talked about what had to happen by 2030. They said, hey, we want you to actually talk about climate change. We want a climate debate. There was eventually a climate debate. They won that. And they said, we want a Green New Deal. We want a transformative law that will change this country. One of the people who, like me, was middle-aged by this point, who was sort of, maybe you could say, a child of the Inconvenient Truth era, who grew up in the climate movement, is this woman. Her name is Sonia Agarwal, and she would become one of my closest friends and one of the most impressive people I've ever met. Sonia Agarwal, at the time, was working for an organization called Energy Innovation. What they were doing was helping to think about how we could decarbonize the entire planet. And what they did was they built this tool. It's called the Energy Policy Simulator. And it allows policymakers all around the world, because there's different ones for different countries, to log in and to think about what would happen if I changed this policy? How would carbon pollution go down, or other pollution like methane? What would happen if I did this? To actually think about structural changes to policy that would reshape our economy. And they were having a lot of success with this work. Sonia was advising people all around the world, really, about how we could make transformative changes to policy. She was also pregnant at the time. She was about to have her first child. And on her due date, which was September 9th, 2020, just weeks before the presidential election, not knowing who would win, not knowing if it would be a second Trump administration, not knowing if we would have a chance to pass a transformative climate law because the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate and the White House, she went into the hospital. She had to check to see if the child was ready to be born. And when she came out that day, the baby was not born, but the sky was orange. The sun never came up that day because there were forest fires burning north of San Francisco that turned the skies orange. It was a reminder of what the stakes were for her own personal life in terms of her decision to have a kid, what kind of world she was bringing her child into, and what her responsibility was to change that system. Now, you all know what happened next. It's a relatively happy ending to the story. Joe Biden was elected president. It took about a week. I don't know if you all lived through that week. Remember, Tuesday happened, and then it wasn't until Saturday that they called the election. A little stressful. Joe Biden was elected president. Keep in mind, this is just weeks after Sonia has her kid. She gets a phone call. They ask her, hey, would you help out with the transition? Would you help us try to staff the Department of Energy? And she says, okay, sure, I could do that. Yeah, sure. She helps out a little bit, even though she has a kid. Then she gets another phone call. They say, hey, would you be willing to join the White House? Brian Deese, who had worked under the Obama administration and was going to join the Biden administration, he was the National Economic Advisor, he had seen that under the Obama administration, climate change did not get enough priority and focus within the White House because of the way the policy councils were set up. This is a little boring and in the weeds, but essentially we've got a National Security Council, a National Economic Council, a Domestic Policy Council. And sure, some of them might care a little bit about climate change, but that issue tended to get lost within all the other important things that those people had to do. And so he, along with other people, such as Ron Klain, who would go on to become the chief of staff to President Biden, said we've got to actually set up a climate policy office within the White House. We need people whose full-time job it is to report to the president about climate change. Otherwise, this issue will fall too far down the to-do list. And so when Sonia got that phone call, she was asked if she would be willing to serve in the Climate Policy Office. There were 1,000 reasons to say no. Remember, she had just had a newborn. She was hypothetically on her maternity leave, and she already had a really important job. Her work at Energy Innovation was helping to reshape the energy system around the world. But when you get asked if you will go to the White House to serve the president, you probably think you gotta say yes. Now, keep in mind that at this moment, we did not know who would control the Senate. I had a friend, we had been working on this policy report all summer long about, oh yeah, we're gonna win the Senate, and here's how we're gonna pass things through budget reconciliation. You may remember that the forecast going into that election was that the Democrats were gonna have like 52 seats, maybe 53, total wipeout. And my friend who I'd been working on the report with, he said to me, Leah, I've been thinking about it, and it could be that at the end of election night, there's 50 seats for the Republicans and 48 for the Democrats, and the 2 seats for the Georgia senators will go to a runoff on January 5th. And I said, his name's Narayan. I said, Narayan, I think you've been reading too many conspiracy theories on the internet. And guess what? He was right. That is exactly what happened. We did not know who was going to control the Senate. And so when Sonia was asked, would she give up time at home with her newborn child to move her family across the country, she didn't even know if there would be a window of opportunity to pass the transformative climate law that she knew was necessary if we wanted to make real progress on climate change at the pace and scale that's necessary. But nevertheless, she said yes. And she joined a group of other people, including Massachusetts' own Gina McCarthy, Ali Zaidi. This is another person, Jahi Weiss, who will be giving a talk, I think, on Monday at the Kennedy School. Jahi actually had a child basically on Inauguration Day, and he also said yes to this job. So Sonia found her kind of new best friend in Jahi Weiss, these 2 new parents who were going to work on climate change for the president. And then, of course, January 5th happened, a very exciting day. The Georgia runoffs happened, and none other than John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock won their Senate seats. And we knew that we had a chance to pass a transformative bill through this obscure process called budget reconciliation. It is a process that allows you to pass a bill with only 50 votes in the Senate. But of course, that was January 5th. And I think you may remember the next day even better. This is January 6th. The next day, of course, insurrectionists descended on the Capitol, several people died, they tried to basically undermine democracy, and we still are dealing with the ramifications of that event. And on that day, on January 6th, Sonia thought deeply about her decision to join the White House. To be honest, she told me she was a little bit scared. She didn't think that this job would somehow be dangerous, but watching what was going on TV, it made her scared. She had a newborn kid at home. And she also thought that the stakes of this job were too high. And so on January 6th, she sat down and she decided to make a day 1 priorities list for herself, not for the president, for herself. What was she going to try to accomplish during her time in the White House? What were the things that were most important to her? Because she knew that every minute in the White House counted, every hour, every week, every month, and that she would only be there for so long, and that she was giving up time at home with her newborn child in order to take this job. She shared this list with me. She told me that she would leave it open on her computer so that when she was trying to find other files, she'd just stumble across it every few days and be like, oh yeah, this is where I'm trying to go. This is the direction. She wanted to have clarity because she knew that in such a complex organization like a White House, she could lose her way. And she needed to know what she was there for and what she was trying to accomplish. I'll just say that one of her ideas is to get to deliver on President Biden's campaign goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035. That was the thing that we ended up working on together. One of Sonia's first jobs, one of her first assignments in the White House, was to figure out what would the president commit to under the Paris Climate Agreement. You may remember that in 2015, countries from all around the world got together and they said, here's what we can do on climate change. And everybody makes pledges to this. They're called nationally determined contributions. And so Sonia was assigned to figure out what should the United States pledge. This report had come out just weeks before that Green New Deal sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office. Maybe you know this report. Somebody actually left it in my neighborhood in the little lending library. They printed it out and left it there, which totally warmed my heart at the time. This was a really important report, which looked at what do we have to do if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And it was an assignment to the scientists, and they came back and they said, we have to cut carbon pollution by 45% below 2005 levels this decade by 2030 if we want to have a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It's a lot of numbers, but the basic takeaway is cut carbon pollution in half this decade, okay? So Sonia had to figure out, well, what was the United States gonna do? Were they gonna be able to do that? And so she called up the agencies, right? That was her job. She called up the Department of Energy. She called up the Environmental Protection Agency. But keep in mind, this was weeks after the end of the Trump administration. The Trump administration had gutted all of these agencies. People had been fired, or they had quit, or he'd relocated entire offices to Kansas where people did not live. And so half the people quit in the process. These are true stories. And so she struggled to find people who had that vision and sense of possibility and hope, because they had been so hammered by the Trump administration. And so she got some ideas from some people, but she also found herself in a peculiar way turning back to the energy policy simulator. Remember, I told you she had made this tool for policymakers to help them figure out what they could do to cut carbon pollution. Suddenly, she was a policymaker. She was an advisor to the president. And so she went back to her own tool. It was for free on the internet. Anybody could go there. She started to plug in some numbers and ask herself questions. Well, what if we did this? How much carbon pollution could we cut? What if we did that? And she went back to the agencies and presented some of those ideas. You know, she said, if we get to 100% clean electricity by 2035, wow, that's a big cut, right? What if we dealt with methane? How could we do? And so in this bottom-up way, in part using the tool she had created, she figured out that the United States could make a really big cut on carbon pollution. This is Energy Innovation's own analysis using that same tool, which shows all these ways that we can cut carbon pollution throughout the economy. And so it was, you know, she presented this idea to the Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. It eventually made its way to President Biden, and he agreed to her rather ambitious plan. And on Earth Day, he announced that the United States would pledge to cut carbon pollution 50 to 52% this decade, more than the 45% that was required under the IPCC. This was a really huge target. This is really one of the most ambitious goals globally. And it was because Sonia decided to take that job and to give up her time with her family that she was able to make this difference. Now, of course, she knew that without a climate bill through Congress, this would be really hard to do, right? Doing everything through regulations with this Supreme Court, I don't know, man, that would be really hard. So I want to take you to my own January 6th story. As I mentioned, I had been working throughout the summer on a report with my friend Narayan Subramanian, who I mentioned, Sam Ricketts, my student Olivia Quinn, and Bracken Hendricks. These were people from the Inslee campaign. And we had been thinking about, dreaming about, how could we pass a big climate bill through reconciliation? What could we do to the electricity system? How could we get to 100% clean electricity by 2035? And we've been working away on this report, and then we watched the election play out in November. We watched the Senate basically get hung, and we said, well, Sam, I'm going to give Sam credit for this one. Sam said, there's no point to our report right now. We shouldn't work on it. Let's just wait and see what happens. So on January 5th, what did we find out? That actually we did have an opportunity to pass a law. And so January 6th, I spent my day trying to get this paper ready for publication, knowing that there was actually a purpose to the work that we had been doing. The other thing that I did is I'd written this book where it's called Short Circuiting Policy, and I'd interviewed over 100 advocates as well as opponents, and I thought about how did they manage to pass laws at the state level. One of the key things that I found was that people needed to organize and work together. If you had one organization, one nonprofit, and another, and they weren't talking to each other, it was going to be a lot harder to get the law passed. And in fact, when Theda Skocpol, a political scientist here at Harvard, as well as Matt O'Mildenberger, a political scientist at UC Santa Barbara, did postmortems on what's called the Waxman-Markey bill, the really big law we tried to pass during the Obama administration on climate action, what they consistently found was that it had not been enough of a broad-based movement to pass the law, that it was really one organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, that was playing behind the scenes and wasn't really building a broad coalition of groups who wanted to see that law pass. And so I had that in the back of my head, and I went to Evergreen Action, which was focused on clean electricity, and Rewiring America, focused on electrification, you know, my two obsessions, clean electricity and electrification, and I said, we have got to organize. We have got to get everybody who wants to get clean electricity into this bill to start hanging out on the Zoom. Remember, it was the pandemic. We need to start meeting. We need to organize. And so we set up a clean electricity working group, and we set up what's called the Federal Electrification Policy Coalition. And of course, other groups were doing this too. The Equitable and Just National Climate Platform is an amazing alliance between environmental justice groups and big green climate groups, as is the Climate Action Campaign. And so this time, we were a lot better prepared. We were actually talking to one another as a movement and trying to work together. We made a lot of progress. We managed to get a bill that was being discussed in the Senate through the budget reconciliation process in the House that would cut carbon pollution 45%. This is a figure that Senator Schumer's team made at the time, and it included something called the Clean Electricity Payment Program. This was the idea that came out of that report that I wrote on January 6th, alongside all those other people. It was a huge plan, $150 billion to decarbonize our electricity system, and it went alongside a bunch of clean energy tax incentives. And there were lots of other things that I had been working on in these little slices, and we were starting to finally make progress. This was in the summer of 2021. The second thing I really learned when I thought about the post-mortem of the Waxman-Markey bills that I mentioned by Scotchpole and Mildenberger was that if we didn't get grassroots movement, if we didn't get people calling Congress and putting pressure, this might never happen. And I would call up all the big groups that have very large lists. I won't name them here for politeness reasons, but you can imagine them. And I say, hey, when are you going to turn on the phones? When are you going to get people to call? When are you going to get people to write emails? I will say the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, which is not a big green, but is an amazing organization, did it the whole time, love those people. But the really big groups, they weren't doing it. And so I finally said, I'm going to do it. Keep in mind, I'm literally a professor. And I called up this wonderful person named Jamie Henn and Duncan Meisel, who's a longtime campaigner. And they said, well, we can just do that. And we literally, with $0, created a website, made a phone number, told people how to call Congress, and started to drive tens of thousands of phone calls into Congress to pressure for this bill. And the best thing was a bunch of people copied us. They made their own phone caller. So Justice Democrats and the Sunrise Movement did it. A bunch of corporate groups did it. And suddenly we started to have grassroots power pushing on Congress to actually act. I also did an enormous amount of media work for this bill. I took over 200 interviews during this time. Anytime anybody asked me if I'd talk to them, I said yes, maybe because I was mad, but I just felt that every single opportunity to talk about climate change was a potential opportunity to change the world. This is an image of me on Democracy Now! At the tail end of July. At the time, there was a bipartisan infrastructure bill working its way through the Senate, and it was not a climate bill. This was not a climate bill. And I was out there alongside people like Senator Markey and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others saying, no climate, no deal. If you don't pass a climate bill, we don't support your infrastructure bill. And it just so happened that at the time of that interview, you know the Zoom room when you see behind the screen and people aren't wearing pants? My version of that is that I was actually in a hospital room at the time. I was quite pregnant, in a very high-risk pregnancy, and I had to be hospitalized for continuous monitoring. And so I asked them, if you don't know, Democracy Now! Goes on at 8 in the morning, and I was in California, so that was 5 in the morning. And even though it was the summer, the sun is not up at 5 in the morning. And so I said, hey, could you guys get me a light to one of the nurses? And they wheeled in this light that's better used to get a baby out of a vaginal canal than to light a television interview. And I will say that one of the lights was broken, so we were not misusing medical equipment, just for the record. And 2 days later, my children were born. My children ended up staying in the hospital for several months. During that time, I testified in front of Congress, and the day that I brought my kid home from the hospital, there was a forest fire burning nearby in Santa Barbara, just like what happened to Sonia, because the climate crisis was already unfolding. That day was my own child's due date, because they were born rather early. And on my child's due date, I got a call from a journalist named Coral Davenport. She is the New York Times journalist who always gets the scoop. She said, hey, Leah, I got the deal, I got the scoop. That bill, that idea, the Clean Electricity Performance Program thing that you've been working on, you know, like massive personal sacrifice to get that done, mentions a no on it. So it's dead. So do you have a comment? And I sent her, I need 5 minutes. I hung up on her. I talked to all these other people, and I said, what do I say? You know, I have to communicate the gravity of the situation, but I don't want to upset people. And I called her back, and I gave her this quote. It says, this is absolutely the most important climate policy in the package. We fundamentally needed to meet our climate goals. That's just the reality. And now we can't. And I just started to trail off. And my husband was looking in the background. He's like, stop talking, stop talking. And I was like, this is sad. It's so sad. And he was like, I was like, she's not going to use that. Well, did she put that on the front page of the print edition of the New York Times? She did indeed. And they say you should be careful what you say, because you never know what will end up in the front page of the New York Times. And unfortunately, you know, the devastation emotionally from the movement was really hard. The fallout from this was hard. Within days, one of my students, Nikayla Jefferson, a member of Sunrise Movement, started a hunger strike in front of the White House. And so I watched several young people starve themselves because of their sadness and belief that this was a really huge loss. And unfortunately, one of the people who was working with us in that organizing group took his life in the time after this. It was really rough. That being said, I got a text that day from someone who worked for Senator Schumer, and he said, hey, Leah, that's not very helpful. Some of us are trying to still do this, and there's still so much worth saving. And it snapped me out of it. It made me realize that if we really believed that this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, then it didn't matter if my thing was dead. There was more ways to cut pollution. And so I spent my Saturday, because it was a Saturday, working alongside congressional progressives in the House, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Senator Tina Smith, and figuring out ways that we could fill the hole. Senator Schumer did the same thing, as did Sonia Agarwal in the White House. And we figured out ways we could put policies into the package that would cut carbon pollution. I'm running out of time. Of course, it's a long story, but I'll just give you the last parts of it. Senator Manchin in December went on television, and he said the entire bill was dead. I call this period the Dunkelflaute, which for my German-speaking friends in the audience is the dark doldrums in German. It's a period for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow and you can't make enough renewable energy, and that's the period we went into. We could not seem to get this bill going again. Then he killed the bill again in July. Here we have Coral Davenport and Lisa Freeman with that story. That was a really, really dark time. And I stayed up, when he killed the bill again in July, I stayed up very late that night. I was crying, it was rough, and I wrote a piece. It's called What Joe Manchin Cost Us, and it ran in the New York Times for the entire weekend. Alongside hundreds of other activists, we criticized Joe Manchin. We said that he was dooming his own grandchildren. And secretly, unknowingly to us, that Monday, so this all happened over the weekend. That Monday, he went back to Senator Schumer, and he said, actually, maybe we could still have a deal. I was texted a press release 10 days later on Joe Manchin's website that said, Manchin supports the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And I said, what the hell is the Inflation Reduction Act? They had been secretly negotiating in the basement and still got to yes on climate. The amazing thing is that this bill will still cut carbon pollution by an estimated 40% below 2005 levels. That gets us 4/5 of the way to that goal that Sonia helped set in the White House. It's still a transformational bill, despite all the crap that Joe Manchin put in it, and despite all the things he cut out. And so it was that in August 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act got signed into law. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions now.
Well, Leah, thank you so much for that thrilling, very exciting presentation. I'm left pretty hopeful, actually, which is not something you often have when it comes to climate change.
That's why I wore the sweater. It wasn't morning clothes.
Well, that was going to be my next point. Was your sweater just really blew my socks off almost. So I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about what you learned in this process of trying to get this transformational bill passed.
Yeah, I was a political scientist, I still am. So it's not that I didn't know anything about how bills become a law. But I wasn't actually an expert in the congressional process. You know, Sam Ricketts, who I mentioned, he also had a child during the same period. He's going to be someone else I write about in the book. He worked for he worked for Representative Inslee at the time. He served in Congress, Inslee, before he became governor of Washington State. And so he was a real creature of the Congress. He'd worked in the House. He knew everybody. He knew what the Energy and Natural Resources Committee was, what the Environment and Public Works Committee was. He knew how the House and Senate worked. And so he really mentored me in many ways and taught me a lot of things over a really short period of time. And you know, that was a really big learning process for me. And I feel that doing applied work, even as academics, can feed back into our academic work, you know, that it can help sort of make the academic work that we do more living and more real and really reflect reality.
Something that was really interesting in your talk was this paradigm shift around energy efficiency. And we've had a question here about whether efficiency is relevant at all. Do you think there's still a place for that, or do you think it's sort of obsolete given the necessary changes we need to make as a society?
Well, the good news is that the clean electric machines are the most efficient machines anyway. If you look at the efficiency of the most efficient gas furnace, something I've spent far too much time thinking about, it's like maybe 98% efficient. If you look at the heat pump, it's 400% efficient. And so the movement to electric machines is also the choice for the most efficient machine. This isn't really a trade-off. The point that I'm making when I critique energy efficiency is not that, you know, it's a bad idea that we shouldn't save energy or reduce our energy use, but the fixation on that to the exclusion of actual transformational change that moves us out of the fossil fuel-based energy system is a distraction. That I don't want an efficient gas machine anymore. I want an electric machine. And this paradigm shift really has been pushed, of course, by people like Saul Griffith, who helped found Rewiring America, this organization that I'm part of, which is really trying to help people understand that if they want to make individual behavior changes for the climate crisis, the best thing they can do is buy electric machines, get a heat pump hot water heater, you know, get an electric car. Those are the big changes that we actually have to make.
And on a similar vein, do you think there's still a place for individual actions, for recycling, for the, like, should we still be doing those things, or should we focus all our energy into like calling Congress, collective action?
I mean, look, I'm an environmentalist. There's this like meme right now that's like, of course, like, I'm an environmentalist. Of course I'm gonna compost. You know, this meme on the internet. See, I'm young and hip. I know memes. So, I mean, look, I compost. I ride a bicycle. You know, I do all those things. But the point is that that isn't going to break the system. It's not going to change the system. It's great if you want to do that, if that gives you meaning, if it helps you act in line with your values, but we should not confuse ourselves that that is going to get us where we need to go at the pace and scale that's necessary. And we should recognize that the people who want us to believe, who want us to fixate on self-purification in our small little carbon footprint way, that's the fossil fuel industry. They like us to focus inwards rather than trying to actually disrupt the system. Because if we focused our energy on disrupting the system, that would actually threaten them. All of our purification, self-fixation, it doesn't threaten them in the least. That is why BP, the fossil fuel company, is the one that popularized the carbon footprint.
And so we've had this paradigm shift towards collective action. Has the fossil fuel industry had a similar paradigm shift? What are you seeing from their side to try and, you know, combat this in ways that we wouldn't normally think about?
They've always been organized. They got the memo a lot faster than us. You know, the American Petroleum Institute, the Global Climate Coalition. The Global Climate Coalition, if people don't know, was one of the denial organizations that operated throughout the 1990s that organized the industry to lie to all of us about climate change. I didn't tell this story, but the first time I heard about climate change, I was in high school, and I had this brilliant geography teacher, and he presented climate change as a debate. We didn't really know just because CO2 levels were going up and temperatures were going up does not mean that CO2 was causing temperatures to go up, obviously. That was when I first learned about climate change. Why? That wasn't an accident. It wasn't something wrong with my teacher. The fossil fuel industry literally is still writing textbooks that deny the science of climate change. They are putting these messages into society that confuse everyday people. So they have been organized from the start. And the question is, can we get organized enough to oppose them?
we've had some questions of wanting to know a little bit more about your background. Someone was asking, beyond the failure of the Waxman-Markey bill, were there other moments before you worked on this major bill that really shaped your thinking about what was possible and what strategies would really work?
Yeah, so I mentioned this briefly. I wrote this, what I believe is a boring academic book. It's called Short Circuiting Policy. The whole time I was writing it, I was like, no one will ever read this book. This is a waste of my time. I should be trying to change the world. Instead, I'm writing a boring academic book. The strange thing was that actually a lot of people read that book. Bizarrely, it became what is an academic bestseller. And I think the reason why is because through the process of interviewing over 100 people who had passed renewable portfolio standards, clean electricity standards, net metering laws at the state level, what I was trying to do was understand, how do we change policies? What does that actually look like? I have this crazy schematic diagram from that book which shows how we can use public opinion to change the laws, how we can use the media to change the laws, how we can use the courts. And so those same strategies that I often saw our opponents using to try to roll back clean energy laws, I started to think about how we could use them to try to pass clean energy laws. And that's, for example, why I was so adamant that we needed to have everyday people calling Congress, because we needed Congress to believe that everyday people cared about climate change. That's why I did so many media interviews, because we needed as much coverage of climate change in the media as possible. We needed people to believe that this was something that people wanted. And of course, that's true. People do want climate action, but we have to make that visible to politicians. And that was something I really learned when I was researching my first book.
And do you think that, I mean, you sort of answered this, but do you think that, even when there's maybe not a bill on the table, is it worth us as constituents writing to our senator, calling our congressman, and really pushing this issue onto their agenda?
Absolutely. So I'm going to be giving a talk in the Gov department, the political science department at Harvard, I don't know, 2 weeks from now or something. And I'm presenting this other paper that I'm writing with a bunch of colleagues, David Brockman, Alex Hurdle-Fernandez, my student Olivia Quinn, and Matto Mildenberger. And what we did, it's a really cool paper, is we got data from Congress about who contacts Congress. This is data that nobody's ever seen before, right? It's kind of a black box. You know that people are calling about, ceasefire, or they're calling about, January 6th or whatever. You know that's happening. But you never get to see it, right? We never can see inside the black box of what happens in Congress. But with this paper, we partnered with one of the software providers, and they gave us the anonymous data so we could see an aggregate, what are people talking about? And we have it over 4 years. And what we see is that, and I was just watching Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing like her Instagram Live, which you should just always watch if you want to be inspired. She's so brilliant and just says brilliant things. But she was just saying like, hey guys, you need to have sustained pressure. Keep calling, keep writing. Because what we really see in the data from that paper is that there's a spike around like a news event or an event, and then it really trails off. And if we want Congress to act, we want them to do things, we have to have sustained, ongoing pressure. And so yes, it's not just one and done calling Congress. You can call Congress every day if you want. They'll put you on a frequent flyer list, I think is the name for it. But that contact really does shape how members of Congress understand what their constituents want.
And so you're here at Radcliffe working on this book. It's going to be amazing. We can't wait to read it. But some of our viewers want to know if you're working on any other policy measures at the moment, and what's next for you besides the book on a policy front.
Yeah, I feel like I cursed myself a little bit, although it's really just the world, it wasn't me. When I wrote my first book, one of the big arguments that I made was that we don't really know what laws are until they're implemented. I have this concept called the fog of enactment, which is this idea that when we pass the law, like there's a lot of uncertainty and we don't know what the consequences are going to be. And that's because it's during implementation that a lot of the details get worked out. And so, unfortunately or fortunately, the activism never ends. I'm still working with a large number of environmental groups, primarily Rewiring America, but other groups too, to make sure that the law is implemented well. For example, on Monday, there's a comment deadline for this thing called 45V. If you want to do policy, you really start to have to get into alphabet number soup, where you need tax code 25C, 25D. I don't know, this is not like a very compelling rap song or something. But 45V comments are due on Monday. It's for the hydrogen rules. Why does this matter? There's a really lucrative tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act which helps produce hydrogen. Theoretically, this could help decarbonize parts of heavy industry, but if it's not done properly, it could actually prop up coal plants and gas plants in the electricity sector. And so alongside amazing work, primarily by the Natural Resources Defense Council, people like my friend Sam Krasnow and Rachel Fakhri, they're doing a lot to try to pressure the Biden administration to make tight rules. And the draft rules are pretty tight. They did a good job. But the problem is the industry is trying to fight them. They're saying that they want those rules to be weak. And the issue with the movement is that we focus so much on passing the law, if we're lucky, if we actually do that, but that we struggle to keep that momentum going during implementation. And if we don't stay in the fight, the organized interests will be there, and they will do things that don't actually further our goals. So, that's one of the things that I'm still working on to try to make sure that this law can make as much carbon pollution cuts as possible.
And just one final question. Sometimes it can feel really overwhelming to deal with the climate crisis and everything we see going on right now. What is it that gives you hope to keep going?
The most common question. It's what can I do and what gives you hope? Those are the ones. I already told you what you can do. Electrify, electrify, electrify. Also organize, organize, organize. I feel like every 1/10 of a degree matters. This is something that the scientist Katherine Hayhoe talks about a lot. Climate change is not, as Rob Verchick, our wonderful fellow said, it's not a pass-fail exam. What we do now will change the future. And I think too many people think the story's already written. It's not. We didn't already do the pollution in 2050. We're still here in 2024. We still have time on the clock. Now, is it getting tight? Is the game looking a little stressful? Yes, and I'm very bad at sports metaphors, so I should stop with that as soon as possible. But the point is that the future is not yet written, and what we do now can change that. And so I feel that staying involved in activism and doing what I can to try to change the future gives me hope, because it gives me a sense of agency, what we call self-efficacy, right? Maybe perceived control, which is a funny way of saying it, right? It gives me a maybe false sense that I can do something about it. And I think that is what allows me to keep my eye on the prize, because every 1/10 of a degree that we cut makes a huge difference for literally billions of people around the world, let alone all the other organisms like the frogs, for example.
Well, on that note, we've run out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But thank you so much, Leah, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to the audience for your questions.
Yeah.